Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org. This episode of Acton Line was recorded at Acton University, our flagship conference. Acton University is a 4-day exploration of theology, philosophy, entrepreneurship, international development, and market-based economics. Each day is filled with thought-provoking presentations on the intellectual and practical foundations of a free society. At Acton University, you can sharpen your intellect, expand your worldview, and learn the foundations of genuine human flourishing. To learn more, visit university.acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Peter Boettke. Pete is Distinguished University Professor of Economics at George Mason University, as well as Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today we'll be talking about sort of importance of history of economic thought, and particularly importance of sort of the Austrian school, and a little bit about that school. Pete is is maybe the world's greatest expert on the Austrian tradition. I've read a ton, been influenced by him profoundly, and I'm so honored to have him here. Pete, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to begin with a strange story to sort of kick off our conversation. During COVID, I had a bit of a yoga practice before that, and with the lockdowns, the studio shut down, and they geared up remote classes in pretty short order. But one of the things that the teacher asked me to do, I was talking to her about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and she said, "Would you like to lead a study on this for the other students who might be interested?" And I said that'd be great. And so I sent out an email to all the other students, and I talked about why it's important to read very old text. Like, a lot has happened in yoga since, the 5th century BC, or, scholars date it differently, but a lot of things have happened. And a lot of things have happened in economics since Adam Smith, since the Austrian school, all of this. And I looked at an old essay of yours that you had written, I think, for EconLog, about why it's important to revisit these figures. And I used your argument as an example, and I quoted you in this email to fellow students about this, because it so profoundly affected me in all the work that I do. Could you unpack that argument for our listeners, why it's important to read these old figures and not just pick up the latest economics textbook?
Thank you for that. That's fascinating, actually. I think that's true in so much of life, and reading political theory, reading law, reading philosophy, or anything. The title of the essay is called "Why Read the Classics in Economics," and I was very much influenced by a professor of mine named Kenneth Boulding. If the listeners don't know him, please look him up. He is the second John Bates Clark Medal winner, which is the highest award that can be given to an economist under the age of 40. The first winner was Paul Samuelson. The second winner was Kenneth Boulding. But at that very time, Samuelson was publishing his Foundations of Economics. And Kenneth Boulding wrote in the Journal of Political Economy, one of the flagship journals of our profession, a critical review of the book. And he argued that Samuelson's mathematical economics may prove to be too flawless to help us in understanding the human condition, whereas the literary vagueness at the borderland of economics and sociology may prove to be more fruitful scientifically. Among the early John Bates Clark Medal winners, Boulding is the only one not to be given the Nobel Prize. Yeah. He went on to have a very illustrious career, was president of the American Economic Association, all these things like that, but he was always viewed at an arm's distance after he put that. in the mid 70s, he wrote a paper called "After Samuelson, Who Needs Smith?" And this is where the story kicks in, because what he argues in there is that we all do, because not all that is good in Adam Smith is contained in Samuelson. And in fact, he argues there's still things to learn by wrestling with what Adam Smith dealt with that move us beyond what Samuelson did. And this is what in the literature is called a contra-Whig story, right? So rather than the idea of Whig history, whereas history is written by the victors, this is history that takes into account those who have been pushed aside and everything like that. And that it turns out that there's still things to learn from this. And what he calls that the extended present, that Adam Smith still speaks to us today as part of an extended present, because by wrestling with his ideas, we can make progress on scientific programs today. And so my view is that a large part of what went wrong with economics is that we lost touch of a lot of ideas that could help improve and lost perspective. And so if we return our graduate students to the library to read the classic texts, and we return them to the archives to read the actual historical progress of an economy, we would do much better in getting our students to think soundly.
Yeah.
And I think, just thinking about that in applied to other areas, the sort of, yoga is an interesting story because it's actually a deep philosophical position in combination with an exercise. Yeah. Right? And so it's all dealing with mind, body, and spirit and all these issues like that. But what gets marketed today is just the body part of it. Yep. But there is these other issues that are associated with it, mind and spirit, which are probably, I imagine that must have been awesome for you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And it's a lot of fun digging in to this tradition. You have these figures. Last year at Acton University, I spoke with James Otteson about Adam Smith. Yeah. And sort of talked about how Smith is continually is still relevant. And today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Austrian school for a couple of reasons. One is it's an older school of economics that a lot of people don't pay attention to now, particularly a lot of people. I mean, at Acton University, you've got a lot of people interested in this and sort of like the libertarian conservative movement. There's an awareness of this. But in the economics profession as a whole, that's not necessarily the case. How is the Austrian school sort of considered in the academy today versus how it's considered in sort of, libertarian conservative fusionist spaces? Yeah.
So the first thing I want to say to your listeners is that from 1870 to around 1950, the main representatives of the Austrian school were considered to be in the elite of the economics profession. Yeah. So Paul Samuelson is the first American to win the Nobel Prize. He won it in 1969, I believe. And he was asked to write an obituary for Bertel Ohlin. And the way he chose to write that obituary was who would have won the Nobel Prize in economics had the Nobel Prize been established the same year the Nobel Prize was established in the sciences. Yeah. So I think it's 1909 or something like that. And so he went through and he goes and gives all the lists. And if you look at that, 8 of the Austrian economists, Paul Samuelson, acknowledges should have won the Nobel Prize in economics, including Mises, including Hayek, but also Karl Menger, Bombavrik, of all these other characters. So Samuelson recognized that, but they viewed it as a thing of the past. This is the connection to what you were just talking about. But they view it as something of the past because they believe that all that they had to say that was valuable has already become part of the common knowledge of what's currently practiced in economics. And so in the post-1950 period, that's when you have a kind of concerted effort to try to reassert Austrian economics as a viable research program in contemporary economics, not something of a chapter of the past, but in the same way you would say classical economists or the Manchester School or whatever. That's what Samuelson was trying to imply. But you start with Mises and then his student Israel Kirzner and Murray Rothbard, and they're really trying to push for a unique Austrian approach to economics that stresses subjectivity, expresses the market process as an unfolding entrepreneurial process, the entrepreneur, the role of the entrepreneur. And so that starts to evolve, parallel. And the dominance of the time of aggregate economics, Keynesianism, and formalistic economics, general competitive equilibrium economics, those two sort of set of eyeglasses end up by making sure that the kind of nuanced position about the understanding of the price system gets lost.
Yeah.
This is an Austrian telling of the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
It gets lost in that regard rather than advancing our scientific understanding, such that even Hayek, in his famous essay on the use of knowledge in society, which is published in the mid-1940s, he refers to the price system as a marvel. Mm-hmm. And he says, I need to use the word marvel on purpose to shock my peers out of their complacency, because they had forgotten how marvelous this system is. Like, it's miraculous that it can do this stuff. It's like a weird, I don't want to invoke sort of, irrationalism or whatever, but it's kind of a weird social alchemy that takes place, right? Mm-hmm. And so, being able to explain that and how that comes about from Adam Smith all the way up to Hayek, that got lost in the models and everything. And so, so Kirzner stressed the entrepreneurial element, which the entrepreneur was a nuisance in the theory. But you guys, produced a film on the role of the entrepreneur and the power of the entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs are what drive capitalism. So we need to not push him aside. He needs to be essential, or her needs to be a central character in the story. In macroeconomics, our understanding of, money, because it's easier to model money if money is neutral. But money by its nature is 1/2 of all exchanges. And therefore, if you manipulate the monetary unit, you're going to manipulate all the exchanges and distort the economy. So that was kind of lost from view. And then in addition, the idea that our capital structure of economy is made up not of, homogeneous goods like putty clay, right? But instead, heterogeneous goods with multi-specific uses, more like a Lego set. Mm-hmm. And if you make an error in building a Lego set, you have to start all the way back from the beginning. If you make an error with Play-Doh, you just smush it and move it into the next round. Yeah. And so economists were more comfortable doing the Play-Doh version of capital versus the Austrians wanting us to do this. So you can see now that, if you combine the issue having to do with the manipulation of money along with the capital structure, that you can get a boom and bust cycle, which again, it's not like the Austrian theory was ever theory in search of data. It was data. We had cyclical volatility that was search of an explanation. All right. And so the Austrians were offering an explanation, which had at its roots the manipulation of money and credit by the central bank and the distortions that caused in the price system, which led to the errors in the capital structure, which is why you get the boom and bust. That was all hidden from view with a focus on macro aggregates like, the unemployment rate or the GDP level and all these kind of things like that. And so they just were these different parallels moving along. And over time, there's been various efforts in which some Austrian ideas were lopped onto by other people. Yeah. Obviously, when communism collapsed, all of a sudden, even Robert Hallbrunner is saying, oh, Mises was right, you know. But then the fact that Mises was right didn't change the way they did economics. And so, it's an ongoing battle in this regard. But, on the one hand, I'll get to your I'll get to your big question.
No, this is all good background.
But I also want to stress to your listeners that there is a scientific tradition in Austrian economics that has made inroads in the economics profession, not to the extent that we would like, but to some considerable extent. So Israel Kirzner taught at a top university, New York University. His work on competition and entrepreneurship was a flagship work. He won the International Award for Scholarship in Entrepreneurship. He was shortlisted in the Thomson Reuters, thing for the idea of a Nobel Prize in economics when they were going to give it to the field of entrepreneurship, which would have been Baumol and Kerzner, and that just passed. They gave it somewhere else, and they didn't give it there, and then we got the financial crisis.
Yeah.
So then that's not the way that people think about these things anymore. But, Israel Kerzner has advanced. Mario Rizzo has made, Larry White, who just retired, he's in the top journals in money and banking and publishes with the top presses. And so there have been people that have followed the traditional academic route, have succeeded on various margins, haven't completely won the day, right? So I'm not suggesting that, but they have
they're making contributions.
They have a place at the table. Now, there's also a group of people that are very influenced by Austrian economics, and it's one of the great strengths of Austrian economics from the beginning is that it appealed to people that were beyond the scientific traditions of practices, scientific practices. That is, journalists and policymakers and policy analysts and general public and these kind of things. Henry Hazlitt, one of the great thinkers influenced by the Austrian school, was the lead economics editorial writer at the New York Times during the Great Depression. People forget that. He worked at the Wall Street Journal. He had the radio show that was promoting, sort of good economic ideas. His columns, when he wrote for The Nation, were used, we have letters from people that teaching at the University of Chicago in the 1920s in which they're handing out, in 1930s, handing out Henry Hazlitt's columns to their students, like the way we would hand out an op-ed to a student today. And then Henry Hazlitt was at Newsweek. And, he while he was at Newsweek, his Business Tides was a best-selling, people paid attention to it every week. And so he was this major journalist that shouldn't be forgotten. And Economics in One Lesson sold millions of copies, And so he was a great educator within the Austrian tradition for the general public or general intellectual public. And, today we have that in people like Tyler Cowen. He just got listed by Time Magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in philanthropy. Tyler is, a top blogger and all these things. My other colleagues that I have been very influential in that realm. And so we have a public intellectual space as well. And that's, a lot of the fusion and libertarians, they center around that. My friend Steve Horowitz, who unfortunately passed away, he used to refer to it as celebritarians, right? So there's a subculture of academics who focus their energy more on public intellectual life, and they've been very successful. Brian Kaplan's one of them. He's my colleague. They focus a lot on trying to reach that audience. And so that audience is huge. Now, does that mean that, it gets him citations in the American economy? No, right? It doesn't. But on the other hand, it gets him thousands and thousands of followers. And so this is the world that we're in right now, is that you have, people who are very influential on social media, and you have people who are very making inroads, but not, beating their head against it. One of the more successful younger Austrians is Peter Klein and Nikolai Voss, and that's in the focus of entrepreneurship studies. And they've done very, very well. They're like leading scholars in that field. So they would be a good example to point to people being able to make inroads in the cutting edge of academia using Austrian ideas. And so we have these two things going on. And the reason why we think weird about it is because one of the great strengths in the older days was that Milton Friedman was both.
Yes.
All right. And now we have a more bifurcated. So you either do that or you do this, rather than the idea that you're, like Milton Friedman, who is, the example to give is that he gave his presidential address to the American Economic Association in 1968, which led to the whole issue of rules versus discretion and the idea of winning over rules and monetary rules. Well, at the same time, he's already published Capitalism and Freedom, and he's working on his own columns in Newsweek. So he did the what then would have been social media, and he did the science at the same time.
Yeah.
Rather than bifurcate it. And so I think right now, so I was part of a symposium a few years ago that says, why is there no Milton Friedman today? And one of the answers was, well, there is. It's just that we have not one, but like thousands of voices, on all these different podcasts and op-eds and blogs and everything like that. And I still think it's relevant that we don't have a Milton Friedman in a fundamental sense, because we don't have any one person who is both that respected professionally and that successful in the public space.
Yeah.
And it's that which I think is a unique thing that Friedman had. Even Hayek doesn't quite, Hayek had that at some level, but he wasn't quite as successful in the public realm as Friedman was.
Yeah.
And, he was different. Both of those are Nobel laureates in economics. So they're the pinnacle of the success of science. So you can't say they were ignored. It's just one last thing on this, because I want to get the record straight on this, because this is true about Mises as well.
Yeah.
So, Mises oftentimes gets portrayed in a martyrdom kind of idea, because we Austrians, like myself, we think of Mises as, perhaps the greatest economist that ever picked up pen to paper, right? And so the fact that not everyone recognizes that means that we get mad and we say, oh, they didn't recognize him. But Mises was a distinguished fellow of the American Economic Association. That is as high an award as you can get other than the Nobel Prize in economics. And he won the highest award for scientific achievement in his own home country back in Austria. All right. So he was recognized as a top scholar. He just didn't have the smooth and easy career that one might expect for someone of his accomplishments.
Yeah.
But a lot of that is a bunch of circumstances of the time, right?
Yeah.
A war. When he comes to the United States, he's already 60 years old, and mandatory retirement in the United States is 65.
Yeah.
It's not like today where a professor can stay forever. At that time, they had rules. Mises, in some sense, violated those rules. Why? Because of not being on the full faculty, but he had all full faculty privileges.
Yeah.
So, like when you talk about Mises being a visiting professor, visiting professors can't chair dissertations, like today, right? Like if I was a visiting professor at Grand Valley State, I couldn't supervise, dissertations. But Mises had all kinds of, he was treated like a chaired professor.
Yeah.
It's just that his age was such that he, and so we misunderstand his position. We misunderstand Hayek's positions because circumstances of war, their desire to, do things. Hayek was a professor at the London School of Economics. He could have stayed there for his entire life. But as the new biography shows, he wanted to leave because he wanted to get married to someone else. British society is very, very judgmental on those kind of things to this day. And so he escaped, to the United States. And, and so, all of these, Mises could have stayed in Geneva. But he felt like he had to leave because of the war coming in, and so they again we lose sight of how successful they are because we look at, like, say, for example, someone like Henry Hazlitt and recognize at the end of his life he's writing for Human Events. Yeah, and we're like, oh, see, no one paid attention to Hazlitt. He, again, back in his prime, he was, So now I don't want to poo-poo the fact that they were mistreated given their status as scientists. I do think that, there's good grounds for that. But I also think we overplay the martyrdom kind of aspects of things too much. And that, young listeners should realize that these people were very, very accomplished. They did not reject the scientific discipline. They, in fact, contributed to it. They won very significant awards in doing it because their work was cutting edge. They got the citations. Hayek is still being read today. How many thinkers in his time that were considered to be stronger thinkers, we no longer can name their names, right? And so I think that Hayek in particular has become someone for the ages in the same way that Adam Smith is, or that. And I think that that's an amazing accomplishment.
Hayek is an outstanding figure, not only in economics, but in a broad
Yeah.
range of disciplines, in political philosophy, in, sensory order is a whole different sort of track. There's all sorts of things that he is doing he's not only continually influential as an economist, but also in political science and related disciplines.
Amazing.
Yeah.
He, we have as our motto, when we come into our center, there's a picture of Hayek getting a Nobel Prize, and it has a quote that says, "Nobody can be a good economist who's only an economist." And in fact, I'm getting the quote wrong, but I'm paraphrasing it. But he says, nobody can be a good economist who's only an economist. And in fact, the economist who's only an economist could be a downright danger, right? Mm-hmm. I always have a joke. I say, nobody can be as dangerous as an economist who only knows economics except a social philosopher who knows no economics at all. Yeah. So that's the Boettke proviso. I always kid around. But when you come into our building, you see that. And so we practice. That's why our center is called Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, is because we believe the moral sciences is actually what we are. So that's more like Adam Smith. Yeah. So we want economics to be practiced more like Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill than it was from John Maynard Keynes to Paul Samuelson kind of idea. Yeah. And so this is where, I think that the biggest divorce happens in terms of what you were talking about before, because the mainstream of economics is very much embedded in what Hayek called scientism. Mm-hmm. They're trying to practice a discipline of the study of human action, but with the tools of the natural sciences. Whereas Mises and Hayek, Menger, Mises and Hayek, they were much more using the tools of the humanities. And logic, philosophy, so the system is logically sound, is a key aspect of it. But that is, that is where they're coming from in that economics has a humanitarian goal and a humanistic in its approach in terms of man-centered.
This is what first enchanted me about Austrian economics, was that it's a humanistic social science perspective, and it's not reductionistic and a purely sort of economism. One of the things that as I just finished up talking to Brad Berzer about Russell Kirk, and Russell Kirk gets involved in the Goldwater campaign, and his ideas become sort of politicized at that moment in a lot of ways. But he's really is just as much a literary figure as a political figure. And how do you negotiate that? Because oftentimes when I talk to folks that don't actually read Mises, read Hayek, and I bring up those names, they think doctrinaire, libertarian, politically motivated reasoning. They don't know this humanistic background and this scientific background. And I'm sure you encounter that a lot in professional circles and just talking to people about Austrian economics. How do you answer those sort of queries for people that are, I thought that was just, is that just libertarian economics?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few issues with that. One of them is that in order to, what I was mentioning before, distinguish yourself from in the past, Mises himself never uses that term. This is libertarian economics or this is liberal economics. He just says this is modern economics. Yeah. But he claims it for himself, right? Which is jarring when you're reading it. It's like, the modern economist does this, and you're like, no, they don't, But that's how Mises performed, his thing. Hayek also is very concerned with the liberal project. And so he's talking to young people a lot about how to think like a liberal. And so at the end of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, he has the subtitle of that book is The Liberal Principles of Political Economy and Justice, okay? Mm-hmm. But in my talk that I gave earlier today, I point out what they mean by that, which is what Lionel Robbins points out in a book called The Theory of Economic Policy among the British classical economists. And the point is that he says that liberal political institutions and liberal economics co-evolve together. Yeah, which is because you have to have enforceable and exchangeable property rights in order to then be able to have, mutually beneficial trade and all the other stuff that comes from economics. And so, this notion of the need for property, contract, and consent And what are the institutions that support and encourage and cultivate a respect for property, contract, and consent? Well, those are what we call liberalism or Western liberalism.
Yeah.
And those are at the foundation, as Hume pointed out all those years ago, for us to be able to have civil society. And all you have to do is do the thought experiment. Imagine a world in which you don't have stability in possession, you don't have transference by consent, and no one keeps their promises. What would the world look like, right?
Yeah.
It wouldn't look like orderly in exchange. It would be raiding rather than trading. So the modern economic growth is grounded on the idea of us trading, not raiding with one another. And so this is kind of, how do you get that? So there is this kind of liberalism aspect in the background to economics, but economics itself is just simply the examination of the the situational logic that comes from behaving under certain various rules.
Yeah.
And choices, constraints, consequences, all of that stuff is what we study as economists. And that's independent of whether or not you find yourself under socialism or liberalism or whatever. It's going to have systematic incentives. It's going to have these various things. Even when I gave you the thought experiment, the reason why you can reason through a world without stability of possession, without transference by consent, without keeping promises is because individuals are going to respond rationally in your mind to that environment, and they're going to raid rather than trade. Right. And so this is the aspect of economics which is universal. And so Mises is, when they first read it, they're jarred in the first 100 pages because, he's going through all of this issue of the pure rationation of this model of the human chooser. But I think if you read that book more subtly, you'll see that he's talking about choice under uncertainty, that there's an agony of choice because choice is a voyage into an uncertain but not unimaginable future, and that it's always this wishful conjecture, and then we get disciplined, we get disappointed, we adjust, we adapt, we learn. And so the Austrians are all about the human condition and the role that choice plays in, generating this human condition, and the role that institutions play in shaping those choices that give rise to that. And so we go through each of these steps and we think about that. That's what, is where the drama of human life gets played out. And so the Austrians, rather than it being this mechanical atomistic economics, it's instead a very social and cultural economics that's built in. So imagine the one way to think about this, you were talking to Brad, and Jim Otteson and others, is that you could take Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, and you take Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, you just smush them together. Yeah. And that's what Deirdre McCloskey calls humanomics, right? And that's what the Austrians were practicing, what McCloskey is now calling humanomics. So she's a developer, a practitioner of that with her own nuances here or there, but it's very much in consistent line with Mises and Hayek and Kerzner as well. Yeah.
You write about, you contrast, I've seen you write about, you contrasting mainline versus mainstream economics. And that there's this humanistic tradition of inquiry, of which the Austrians are an exemplary part, but not the sole part. Right. There are other figures. Kenneth Boulding is one of these folks.
School of Salamanca.
Well, this is where I'm going. Is one of the things we do at Acton is we try to do a lot into the sort of prehistory of economics and translating not only Spanish scholastics from the School of Salamanca, but early modern theologians and jurists, philosophers, both Protestant and Catholic. We've got a Sources in Early Modern Ethics, Economics, and Law series. First, I found curious references to these folks in some places. There's a lecture that Lord Acton gives in which he talks about the greater part of the liberal political tradition can be found in the obscure Latin prose of Jesuits, and then he lists Mariana and Lessius and these figures. Is there anybody in the Austrian tradition who picks up on these threads that?
Well, the influence of the Spanish scholastics is quite well known.
Yep.
The first book that was written identifying all that was by Hayek's dissertation student, Marjorie Grace Hutchinson, at the London School of Economics. And she wrote a book on the early Spanish scholastics.
I had no idea she was Hayek's student.
Yeah,
I've been familiar with the book, but that's great.
That's her thesis, that original one. And then I used a story of Juan Mariana in my lecture earlier today about his story where he wrote his track on regicide, and the king was fine with it. It's no problem at all. But then he wrote his track on the king debasing the currency, and the king put him in jail. Right? So, the story of the Spanish scholastics and the reason why they were freed up to study earthly matters and what they were trying to do is just a fascinating story about the birth of a discipline. They're in many ways, and they stressed, because again, there was a lot of Catholic social teaching, that the doctrine of just price, which then both they had to explain in terms of, species flow doctrine, so theory of inflation, but also subjective value, which is, one of the things that they did. So they anticipated much of what later on became the Austrian school, which is why they're viewed as part of the prehistory of the Austrian school. And Murray Rothbard's picked up on that, building off of Grace Hutchinson's work. And now, the whole group of people in Spain, that are associated with Jesus Huerta de Soto, but also, Gabriel Calzada and that crowd, and UFM, University of Francisco Marroquin. They're keenly aware of the role that the Spanish scholastics played. And what comes with that is a much broader commitment to not only the sort of the sound economics, but also natural law and other aspects of the moral system. You have a sign out front here, something like combining the virtuous society with the sound economics or something like that. And I think that is the mission that those individuals were involved in. And Adam Smith clearly was involved in that mission as well. That carries all the way up to when you talk about Hayek talking about the rules of just conduct and the value systems of that. Mises is a little bit more of a strict utilitarian. Yeah. If you read his book Socialism in full, he has all this other stuff in it too.
He does.
And it's a very subtle work. But he was mainly concerned with trying to demonstrate a logical flaw in the same way that Bombavrik had demonstrated a logical flaw in Marxist theory. He wanted to demonstrate a logical flaw in the idea of central planning, which is also critical to Marx theory. So Bombavrik had shown that there was a problem in Marx's value theory, the transformation from values into prices and therefore the system and then distribution. And so it's Marx's theory of value and distribution that Bombavrik closes in Karl Marx in the close of his system. Yep. Again, technical economics. So they didn't want to go to debating any of the ends. They just wanted to stick strictly with the effectiveness of means to given ends and the logical flaws in the analysis. And that's what Mises wanted to do there. Yeah. Hayek does that as well, picks up on that, and is a little bit more nuanced even than Mises. But then after he gets done, he wants to talk about what can sustain the liberal society. And that's when he gets back to these kind of older, more broader discussions about the rules of just conduct, the rule of law, and whatnot. And so that's where you get back again this broader notion of political economy and moral philosophy.
Yeah. So
if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. My colleague Dylan Palman wanted me to ask you about Kenneth Boulding, so I'm glad that Boulding has come up. He's done a little bit of work on Boulding, and Boulding's a fascinating figure in a lot of ways. And one of them is he's I believe he's a Quaker.
A Quaker,
So
when he passed away, all the Quaker schools honored him for the week or whatever with the way that they do that. I think silence or whatever. Yeah. So like Swarthmore and all of them. Yeah.
Oh, no, I had not heard that. But there's a point at which Boulding has a great turn of phrase when he talks about the people in pursuing scientific work. This is an exact quote. Who are also have a strong religious understanding. Have the uneasy burden of explaining the one to the other and being misunderstood by both, all the time, basically. Acton has this problem in his life in The Rambler. He sees what he's trying to do is bring the Catholic Church in the 19th century in dialogue with historical science and then all sorts of other disciplines as well. And, he views it as a fight on two fronts against, those who have little faith and those who have none at all, trying to battle both. Hayek has an interesting personal story of being born Catholic, returning to the faith very late in his life. Mises is throughout his life an atheist, I believe, but he does revise, and so he has some criticism of Christianity and socialism that over the first and the second edition gets downplayed a little bit and softened. What is the relationship of sort of figures in the Austrian tradition to religion as a social phenomena on the one hand, but on the other hand, did they think that there was anything, did those that were religious struggle or try to pursue lines of thought where they reconciled the two in interesting ways?
So you also have to remember Israel Kirzner is an Orthodox rabbi, and then, of course, there's been Father Sadowski over at Fordham. He's passed away now, but he was an Austrian and he was a Jesuit, So, and he was the teacher of Mario Rizzo and Jerry O'Driscoll. And so, there's been this various ins and outs. Father Rottenheimer, who's over in Austria right now, is also somebody. He runs the Austrian Institute for Economics and Philosophy. And so there are several people who are devoted to this dialogue. The easiest way for me to talk about it is and I hope this doesn't take us to too long, is that there's been a rise since the fall of communism in a thing called the Association for the Scientific Study of Religion. Okay. It's by social scientists trying to study religious practices. The reason why the post-communism stuff is important is going to come in a second, because the most dominant approach is to use the tools of economics to assess the efficacy of religious practice. Okay. Yep. So, a very simple thing is I'm going to look at church attendance on the East Coast and on the West Coast during football season. And I find out that in the West Coast, attendance goes down because the football games begin at noon on the East Coast, which means that they're at 9 a.m. And so it's become costly. And so therefore I don't go to church as much. Or another thing could be is that why I have Pentecostal religions is because the Pentecostal church serves as a sort of a social network, welfare network for their communities, and I don't want to be overrun by too many people coming in, so I make the entry practice be extreme rituals. And if you don't follow the extreme rituals, you don't get access to the social goods. And so that's one way to do it, and that's kind of very influenced by like a Gary Becker type model or whatever. And that's been very, very influential to people. The other one, which is more consistent, I would argue, with the Austrians, is more Weberian. It's how does alternative religious beliefs influence economic practices? Okay, and that would be like Timur Kuran, who's at Duke, who studies Islam and the role that the Islamic religion plays in its various practices in constraining economic activity, and or how it forces you to have workarounds. Or it could be Deirdre McCloskey talking about how these bourgeois virtues do what? They actually lower the cost of people engaging in economic activity, commercial economic activity, for an entrepreneurship, giving it a go. Because why? Because they actually accord dignity to that, as opposed to distrust towards commercial activity. And so I'm economizing McCloskey. McCloskey's contribution is much broader than that, but I'm reducing it down to like a simple economics explanation. But and so to me is how it is that religious ideas frame the economic activities that we engage in is vital, because it makes us think about the informal norms, or what Adam Smith called disapprobation and approbation of social interaction. So, what we disapprove of, what we approve of. I don't need to have a policeman on every corner because I'm going to internalize the norms. And so I'll respect property. I won't cheat. I won't, I'll cooperate and things like that. And so when the great thou, shall nots become written into us through our moral teachings, they either can be shall nots that nudge us in directions towards productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation, or towards, other areas which are not as conducive to modern economic growth. And so again, there's a great book by Benjamin Friedman on religion and economic growth. Yep. All these things came out of the realization in the post-communist period of that our very first thing that we thought after communism collapsed is communism just had the wrong prices. Get the prices right.
Yeah.
So that's stage one. That was all the stabilization and all the other things like that. And then we realized we can't get the prices right unless we get the institutions right.
Yeah.
So now let's get private property, rule of law, contracts, all these kind of things like that set up in these societies. And then we're like, I can't turn an ocean liner around mid-harbor,
yeah.
right? It's a weird thing. And so I need to get the culture right. So the attitudes and beliefs of the people have to fit with the institutions, and the institutions have to give rise to the property, prices, and profit and loss system. And these things are all embedded in one another. So all of economic life is embedded within political, legal, and social and cultural institutions. And it's that focusing on those social and cultural institutions as the foundation that has taken different directions in modern research. So the cultural, the sort of evolutionary cultural anthropology stuff that might be associated with like Joe Heinrich, which one could read in Hayek's Fatal Conceit, right? Kind of as a forerunner of that. Or you can have, other kinds of discussions of public reasoning, which is, what's Rawls's Christian beliefs, or, how does that influence like what he, might have thought, or when he left away from those or whatever. And so I think we've now wrestling with these issues a lot more than what we were ready to, 20 years ago, where we thought that, it was just a matter of technical.
Yeah.
We put on our white gloves and, we can solve the world just like the engineer in a lab or whatever. And now we recognize that, so much of what our life is made up of is the values and beliefs that we hold and the mental models we hold. And I think this is a big challenge today, because I think the mental model among a lot of young people is one that doesn't see social cooperation as an outcome, but instead only sees social conflict.
Yeah. This is one of those...
Oh, and just Boulding, and just on Boulding was someone who had a wonderful emphasis on the imagination, just like Julian Simon. And what, in his regard, Julian Simon imagined problem solving, and so we could do, so he was fantastic in that. But in Boulding, you have this idea of the moral imagination of stable peace.
Yeah.
Like, how can you get peaceableness? And my colleague, Chris Coyne, is developing a whole research program on this. And it's just really fascinating stuff, because this moral imagination needs to be cultivated. And this is one of the problems when you think about any of the really hairy problems that we have in our world today that are violence on violence on violence. How do you find the solution to that? Well, it's not more violence, right?
Yeah.
And so someone is going to have to take the world as it is, but imagine it as it could be, and then find ways of having the moral imagination to turn those situations of conflict into possibilities for peace and a stable peace. And Boulding was pushing us to think in those terms. And so again, it's scientific in the sense that we want our imaginations to be constrained by the workable.
Yeah.
But we don't want them to be confined to the current system. Right? So it's a kind of an interesting exercise, because we want to unleash the imagination, but not have it be flights of fancy, but instead be grounded. And so that's where I think the kind of going back to what you were talking about earlier, that first part of, human action, where we're talking about the principles governing individual decision making, they play a role in our understanding of what would be incentive compatible, workable possibilities for peace, let's say.
Absolutely. You're doing a lot of work at Mercatus and at George Mason to educate a lot of young scholars. Now it's almost it's generations of
Yeah.
scholars that have come out of these programs who I have been impressed with. I've met so many and been impressed with so many. They're just great, great students, great thinkers, great teachers who are taking this more humanistic Austrian model and figuring out new directions to take it, finding new areas of inquiry. How did that happen? What was the secret sauce for the combination of those two institutions that led to, because there's a whole revival that happened in the 50s through the 70s that we talked about a little bit, but you're part of like a whole new wave of that has been extremely influential.
It's a very, nuanced story, actually, with a lot of particular parts.
Yeah.
A lot of it has to do with role models that were in existence that were not actually directly related, but gave it space. One of those is Jim Buchanan, who was amazing scholar and supporter and encourager. Even though he wasn't part of the Mercatus Center, he, in some sense, allowed the Mercatus Center to be the Mercatus Center, which a lot of other scholars of his time would have not allowed to happen. So that's a kind of a weird thing, which is creating a space for somebody. In many ways, I think of this in philosophy, like with Nozick as well, is that Nozick created a space within philosophy such that people that were influenced by libertarian ideas could, in fact, exist, even though he himself stopped. He didn't actively support him or anything like that. He just sort of stopped doing his thing, but he was such a force that he created a space and then people did things. So I think Buchanan plays a bigger role, and the fact that he located at George Mason then meant that it created a kind of a space there in which economics could be practiced in a way that was different from everywhere else that it was being practiced. And so therefore it was like a scientific and legitimate research program. But then you would have to put a lot of emphasis on the people who found it, the Center for Study of Market Processes. That included the founder, Rich Fink, but also Karen Vaughan and Jack High, and at the beginning, Tom DiLorenzo and Victor Vanberg and Suda Sonoy was there, and John Egger. They all made up the center. And then that center evolved over years. So it went from the Center for Study of Market Processes to the Center for Market Process to Mercatus, and then where it's at today. And there's been pivotal donors, obviously. Charles Koch is a major donor that Rich Fink convinced, many years ago that we had something going on. And the issue that you raise, I think, is important because of the teachers that were involved. So that those original teachers, if you go back in time, except for Karen Vaughan, they were all assistant professors.
Okay.
So the way support was given was not to support the research of a famous professor. So most centers, intellectual centers, are founded to support the research of a famous professor. Joe Blow, potential Nobel Prize winner, let's give them a lot of money and let them do their thing. Here, it was sold from the beginning that, hey, we're going to have students and we'll teach these students. And so then the research was the secondary to the teaching. So, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no,
it
makes perfect sense.
And so as a result of it, so I get done with my first year of graduate school, and Rich Fink pulls me aside and says, okay, so you spent a year in graduate school. What could we do better? In my whole education, no one's ever asked me that. But that's what Rich asked.
Yeah.
What could we do better to provide a better educational experience for you? All right? Because that was the point of the program. Not, what can you do better to help me do my research or help me do my grade? You could have graded better, for me, and then I wouldn't have to grade. And so the center has always been built on this idea of these student programs. And what's happened in the last decade and a half is that we grew a master's program, we grew a PhD program. Those are all internal to George Mason. But then we grew these external programs, these external fellowships, similar to Acton University, that Virgil Storr, my colleague Virgil Storr, is the main architect of. And those have expanded. They're called the Adam Smith Fellowship, the Frederick Bastiat Fellowship, and it's just exploded in numbers and everything like that. And they're built around Socratic seminars. again, they're built not around lectures by faculty, but by texts. So they're very much influenced by the Liberty Fund model of Socratic texts. The texts are based on these classics, like you were talking about earlier, reading Adam Smith, reading Hayek, reading Jim Buchanan, reading Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom. And, we build our work around that. And then in some of the more contemporary ones, we have some of the work that we've been doing that's influenced by that approach that then we wrestle with. But these fellowships have just exploded under Virgil's leadership. And we now are dealing with, as you just pointed out, like thousands of alumni and current students. And it's just amazing. It's one of the most, vibrant sort of intellectual and visible colleges, I think, that's out there. So, when people criticize higher ed, there's plenty of reasons to criticize higher ed. But if you ever follow it, they always belie their rejection of higher ed by doing things like creating, a heterodox academy, which is supposed to fix, the university, or creating a new university like University of Austin. This is what they're doing. But, what we're doing is a similar kind of activity, which is we are working with students at elite institutions that are hungry for ideas and want to simply have a conversation, because in their universities today, they're not having those opportunities. So it's very much like the old, model of the University of, Bologna or whatever, where, people come from all over and then they sit around and talk and things like that. And so that has been an amazing aspect. We still have our PhD program. We still have our master's program. We work with that. And so the way I like to think about this is that we are trying to have a conversation with potential students that could be cultural change makers. And we're training students that can, in our own internal programs, that can become productive participants in that conversation. So the conversations reinforce one another. And so to me, I think this is, it's been a very rewarding and tremendous learning environment. But I'll tell you something that's fascinating about it. When I first started it, I all these years ago, my main idea was I was supposed to get them to get it. Right? So they don't get it. I'm there. We're reading this stuff. Their job is get it, so I'm going to try to get it to them. And it dawned on me very early on that that doesn't satisfy the hunger of a curious student. That's actually what they're trying to run away from. And so instead, I wrote on the top of my notebook, listen to them, right? Listen to them. And so the key issue, I think, and this is, I think, vital for all of us, is that we have to listen. And when we listen, we can see where it is that their conversation, they want to take the conversation, and what are the pressing issues that they have in the conversation. And then there we can engage there. So we have to begin where they are, not where we would want them to be in the beginning. And I think that's true from everything from sound economics to these questions about the virtuous society. Why is it that, and that's why Adam Smith is so vital to wrestling here. Because you wrestle with the theory of moral sentiments. You're actually going through all these kind of questions, like what does it mean to live a moral life? These are the things he's trying to get his students to contemplate when he's giving those lectures. And so to me, I think, that aspect of it has made me respect so much more the nature of dialogue, the obligations of a constructive conversation, and the role that social science and the humanities play in those conversations. And so I appreciate you recognizing that. Again, it's very, Brian Hooks, who is now at Stand Together. For over a decade, he was the main person at Mercatus that was overseeing and marshaling in all these programs. And so I think you can't tell the history of what we've accomplished without telling the history and giving respect to Rich Fink, to Charles Koch, to the John Templeton Foundation, to the Earhart Foundation, various different, same characters in many ways, I'm pretty sure, that have influenced Acton. Financially. But then also Bradley Foundation, I should mention, SCAFE, and then private donors, but then also individuals on the ground that did amazing things, all in their capacity to promote this teaching aspect. And it's just, I work with great colleagues. I wake up every day. I'm so excited to work with them. And, I couldn't be happier in that regard. I'm very, very fortunate academic because I get to work with these really great graduate students. Several of them are here, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's amazing. I run into them here, and I'm like, my smile goes ear to ear when I see, Ennio Piano or Clara or Anna. I have Anna Claire Flowers is here, Caleb Fuller. I mean, there's just like, you run into them, you're like, oh my God, you're here, And then there's a bunch that aren't here, but could be here. Yeah. And Adam Martin, for example, and stuff. And so, it's just a really, really rewarding aspect, and I'm very grateful for the opportunities I've had. But I think the secret sauce, as you put it, is that because of these people like Buchanan giving space and legitimacy, we avoided two sins that take place in academic economics. The first one is careerism. I'm going to do X in order to advance my career, and I don't really care about the ideas anymore. All right.
Yeah.
And there's a big lure of that, because the rate of return for your human capital in economics is quite high if you are able to obtain one of these nice positions. Second is cynicism. I think the whole system is rigged, so I don't care. It's blah, 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 and like that. And so avoiding those two, careerism and cynicism, and instead staying firm to commitment, that I think is what's the consistent thread from 1980 all the way today. The center moved to George Mason University in 1980.
Yeah.
And so just think about that. It has been in existence now for 45 years. And in that 45 years, there's been a lot of changes all in the world bouncing around. And we've adjusted and adapt. We're much more online than we ever used to be. We're doing all the different things. But it's that thread of those commitments to use Hayek's phrase, the liberal principles of political economy and justice, I think is the consistent thread all the way from 1980 to today, and hopefully for another 40 years.
Yeah. I think what you've identified is like a very personalist and humanistic approach to education being paired with a very personalist and humanistic approach to economics.
Yeah.
Is the way that
I think that's a great summary, actually. Yeah.
Thank you so much for
thank
being
you.
with us,
Yeah.
and for all of your great work and all your great scholarship and all your great teaching, because that is such an outstanding part of the whole legacy of both Mercatus and George Mason, is all the wonderful teachers and all the wonderful teachers that come out of that teaching and continue to influence the world in great ways. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.